Who is the professor? Is this position reducible to the individual who's in relation to the other, in this case, the student? If so, then is not the professor-student relationship based in the imaginary? Many a professor and student can attest to the experience of love and hate in the classroom. Look at just about any course evaluation and you'll find evidence for it. Such love and hate are based in the imaginary in various ways. The student's hate may emerge out of an imaginary understanding of the material, and so they think the professor doesn't know what they're talking about. How many times has a student presumed an understanding of the material and yet, when examined about it, not be able to produce evidence of this understanding? On the other side, the student's love may emerge out of their imaginary idealizations of their professor, who is looked upon as offering the image of a unified body, and in this case, a unified body of knowledge, complete and perfect. However, what if there's a third position in the room? The students, the individual professor, and the symbolic position of teacher. What would it mean to occupy that position? How would it break us out of the imaginary student-professor relationship? And finally, what does each position have to do with death? This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Lecture 17 in Seminar 2. Lecture 17 comes in the aftermath of Lacan's discussion on the Purloined Letter, and so given the intensity of the content recently, Lacan seems to slow things down a bit in this lecture, seeking questions from his audience about what has been discussed so far. However, that's not to say that this lecture offers little in terms of substance. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. And so in this video, I address the following questions. How can the teacher-student relation be thought of in light of the imaginary and symbolic? 2, how is the ego related to the subject? And 3, how are the ego and the subject each related to death? This channel addresses works of philosophy and psychoanalysis. Each video, structured by several questions, analyzes a small section as we gradually move through an entire text. To support this work, please consider liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. You can also support this work on Patreon. Link is below in the description. Upon introducing the topic of this lecture, Lacan then switches gears to address the position of the teacher in relation to knowledge and ignorance. He says something very interesting here, which tangentially ties into the topic for this lecture. He says genuine teaching awakens an insistence in students. Here he defines insistence in terms of a desire to know, which emerges only from a position of ignorance. Let's recall what he said about ignorance in Seminar 1, that it's the most important passion for psychoanalysis, and that it's not a mere ignorance, but a learned ignorance like that of Socrates. He then asks his audience to ask him a question, but to ask it in such a way that it's Lacan's question. In other words, he's asking his audience to ask questions that presuppose what they think Lacan is getting at. Though this might seem like an invitation into an imaginary relation, that's not what Lacan seems to be getting at here. Rather, I believe he's asking his audience to assume the position Lacan holds as teacher. A position that's not reducible to Lacan himself, but is sort of like a third figure in the room, the other two being the audience and Lacan himself. Doing so works to move beyond the imaginary relation that has been formed between him as a teacher and his audience as student. Now, throughout this video series, I've been reading Lacan with the intention of teaching what Lacan says, staying as best as possible within what seems to be his aims. Approaching the material in this manner, new insights have emerged for me, helping me to see the limitations of my previous ways of reading him while also trying not to idealize him, which is always a danger with a charismatic teacher. In fact, the contemporary philosopher Jean-Luc Marion, who was educated in France at a time when Lacan was actively lecturing, has said that he was struck by the effect Lacan's charisma had on individuals. So much so, in fact, that becoming Lacanized was a synonym for being lobotomized. Applying these thoughts to this YouTube channel, I wouldn't want a viewer to finish these videos with a sense that they've been given the final meaning of the text, or that there's nothing left to consider here. My goal is not to give correct answers in summarizing and examining these seminars, nor do I hope that viewers are here due to a cult of personality and are led to watch these videos due to some charisma, though I don't think I have much to worry about on that front. Rather than a comprehensive answer to the question, what is Lacan saying? My real goal is to lead you to a more productive misunderstanding of what he is saying. This term is not Lacan's, but something that has emerged out of my reading of Lacan. What do I mean by productive misunderstanding? Perhaps you can think back to a book you read for a second time, being surprised how much you misunderstood the first. Was the first reading pointless? I certainly don't think so, and I believe this for the following reason. The only way I was able to gain the insight I did into a second reading was because the previous reading paved the path. I would have never gotten to the understanding I did were it not for a productive misunderstanding, whether based on my own reading or from some teacher who suggested a way of reading the text that perhaps now I disagree with, but that nonetheless opened the possibility for even knowing how to disagree with that professor in the first place. Of course, this means there are unproductive misunderstandings as well. Generally, those readings lead us astray to such an extent that we're blocked off from further insights, that the desire to know has been extinguished. So what I hope is that in my earnest attempt to understand Lacan and present his thoughts to you, is that I offer a productive misunderstanding that will evoke a desire for you to read Lacan yourself, to embark upon a path of deeper exploration that ultimately leads you to move past my own understanding. I encourage you to read along as we move through these videos, and when you find that a particular understanding I provide does not resonate with your own interpretation of the text, then I certainly welcome that kind of productive engagement in the comments section. And so this, I believe, is what Lacan is getting at here in his excursion about his own teaching as awakening and insistence in his students. Insistence, or the compulsion to repeat, emerges out of the mistake, out of a sense of incompleteness and failure. And this is what I mean by a productive misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that provokes a kind of insistence, which in this case Lacan identifies in terms of the desire to know. And it's the desire and not the knowledge that's important here, because once you believe you know, that you possess knowledge, desire is no more. Lacan's invitation to the audience to ask questions leads us into a discussion on a variety of concepts such as speech, death, insistence, the ego, the subject, unconscious desire, the real, and the symbolic. Of course, all of these are interconnected, as it's difficult to address the relation between any two terms without reference to the others. Nonetheless, it's quite a lot for one lecture, so I've decided to highlight a few points that seem significant and that appear to build upon what's been presented so far. The first point I wish to address is the relation between the ego and the subject. Lacan reiterates much of what he's said previously, that the ego is a mirage and the sum of identifications. He elaborates on its connection to the subject, that it's an impoverished point of synthesis to which the subject is reduced. Yet the ego also represents one of the significant elements of the discourse of the unconscious, a piece of the symbolic, and an indispensable element inserted into the reality of the subject. This appears to be a reformulation of what Freud said in The Ego and the Id, where he writes, the ego is that part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. If we recall, Lacan seems to equate the id with the subject itself, or at least draws a close connection between them. If the ego is derived from the subject, what then is the subject? We've already come across several responses to that question. First, the subject, though identified with the ego, is something or somewhere else, beyond the pleasure principle. It emerges from the symbolic and is intimately tied to desire, which is here in this lecture described as something coming into existence through the symbolic as well. However, this is also where the split in the subject happens. There's the subject who achieves recognition, and then there is that of the subject which is not named, what is, as Lacan puts it, quintessentially unnameable. Lacan states that this split or gap produced in the subject is where the ego takes up residence and is also where death makes itself most felt. The unnameability of the desiring subject is akin to death, and the ego is where death makes itself most felt. How are we to understand this? Though it's not stated in this lecture, I believe that in being inserted into the primitive gap of the subject, the ego functions as a kind of imaginary compensation for this lack, seeking to fill the hole produced by the symbolic. And it's with the symbolic that one finds the death drive and the compulsion to repeat, or what Lacan likes to call insistence. The ego, seemingly associated with the pleasure principle for Lacan, is an attempt to stave off the death drive and its repetitive insistence. We might even say that the ego marks the most recognizable form of response to the death drive. In the work The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, he argues how individuals and societies are built as a defense against the recognition of our mortality. Interestingly, he calls this dimension of ourselves the symbolic self. I'd have to revisit this work a little and look at it a little bit more closely to make sure I'm accurately getting what Becker says here. But assuming it to be accurate for the minute, what Becker describes here as the symbolic self is closer to what Lacan calls the imaginary ego, which, to borrow Becker's phrase, engages in immortality projects in order to manage the terror of death. Such projects come in all forms, from self-tranquilizing highs to frenetic activity to certain hero systems that offer illusions of heaven and transcendent beings that protect us against this terror. Becker's analysis, I think, helps make sense of how the imaginary ego, functioning in the place of Becker's symbolic self, can be where death makes itself most felt. It's felt not in its direct form, which would probably lead to the fragmentation of the ego. Rather, it is experienced in the mode of flight. Support for this is found in Freud, who discusses how anxiety is the flight of the ego. What is the ego fleeing from? Well, according to Freud, it's the libido. Now, what is the libido? Well, in later seminars, we'll see Lacan begin to reconceptualize the libido as jouissance. And jouissance, according to the later Lacan, is the path towards death. I'd like to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also become a Patreon supporter by going down to the link in the description below. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.